Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today I'm going to be talking about missing time. The title of today's episode is Missing Time with Aliens, 12 Astonishing Cases. Missing time is a big issue when it comes to UFO encounters. It's very consistently reported. Many people do not remember the entirety of their encounters. And this can be with a simple UFO sighting, but more often when humanoids are involved. This is quite a controversial issue. Some people do believe the ETs are wiping or blocking people's memories. Others feel that perhaps this is the human mind's reaction to trauma. And there's certainly evidence for both of these scenarios. In many cases, ETs will tell people, you won't remember this, or you won't remember this for some time, or you'll remember it as a dream, something along those lines. But we also know from psychology that trauma can be easily blocked by the human mind. We see this with war veterans, victims of child abuse, anyone who goes through a traumatic incident. This sometimes does get blocked from their minds. At any rate, amnesia is very commonly reported. Often people do experience this. It's a huge red flag that they've very likely been taken on board and don't recall it. I do think that's what's happening in the cases I'm going to cover today, but I think this particular aspect of UFO encounters deserves a closer look, and that's why I wanted to do this episode today. I've got 12 amazing cases for you today, coming from all over the world. Several from the United States, including Alabama, Illinois, New Mexico, New York, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and Virginia. Also one from Puerto Rico, 2 from the United Kingdom, and 1 finally from Brazil. These cases also cover a very long period of time, as early as 1942 up to 2017. So this is how ubiquitous, how often missing time occurs. And that's why it's so important. So let's just get started with our first case, which I call a sense of complete peace. This one occurred in the summer of 1942, somewhere near Surrey, England. And it's an important case for a number of reasons. It's a very early case, predating the modern age of ufology in 1947. A very early case of missing time, which again shows that this has been happening for a very long time. It's also very interesting. This is in wartime, also involving what we would call human-looking or Nordic ETs. There's a lot of interesting elements to this particular case. This case comes from UK researcher Jenny Randalls and was published in her book Abduction. There are 2 witnesses, Bernard and Angela. The information comes largely from Bernard, but as Jenny writes, there is no doubting his sincerity or his intelligence. The encounter occurred in the summer of 1942. This is during World War II. Bernard was 11 years old and his friend Angela was 12. They were very good friends and had gone to a hill near Surrey in the UK to look for empty bullet casings. They then lay down in the grass, and this is when suddenly Bernard says he was overcome with a strange feeling. As Bernard says, "For the first and only time in my life, I felt a sense of complete peace come over me." So they both lay there utterly relaxed, but definitely not asleep, when they heard a man's voice say, "Here they are." Both children sat up and were amazed to see 2 very handsome men wearing bright-colored clothes or a suit of some kind, and as Bernard says, they gave off an aura of pure peace and tranquility. Above them there was a very bright light, which they thought at first must be the sun, but it was radiating heat down on them, so this could have been a craft, they're not sure. At any rate, one of the men approached, kneeled down next to Bernard and Angela, while the other stayed back and held some kind of instrument in his hand. The 2 men spoke to each other, but in a strange way, quoting numbers, talking about time in ways that Bernard and Angela couldn't fully understand. But at one point, Bernard remembers one of them saying, "They are beautiful children, aren't they?" The strangest part, at least so far, was that the men began to speak about the children's future, seeming to know everything that would happen to them. He said many things, most of which Bernard and Angela could not really remember. Bernard does remember that he asked one of the men at one point, "Where do you come from?" The man gazed up into the sky and replied, "I come from a long way away." There was a lot more said, and then finally the man warned them that no matter what happened, the children should not reveal that they had seen them. The men then told them to go to sleep. The next thing Bernard and Angela remember is waking up to see that the two men were gone. They headed down the hill and began to walk home. As they passed a farm, an adult saw them, asked their names, and apparently knew something because he told them to go home quickly. It was at that point that Bernard did notice a little blue kind of puncture mark on the artery of his inner arm. He showed it to his friend Angela, and she looked at her own arm and saw an identical mark in the same place. So they arrived home, thinking that they had been gone for at most 2 or 3 hours. But instead, their parents were frantic, horrified, and of course relieved, because it turned out the children were missing for a full 24 hours. Angela unfortunately had to return to London, and Bernard lost touch with her. But he reports that from that day forward, his life was changed forever. He never was able to remember what happened during the missing 24 hours, but nor could he forget the encounter with these strange men. In fact, he said it caused him to question his own sanity to a degree, and eventually led him to seek the help of doctors and psychiatrists, and finally UFO researcher Jenny Randles, in the hopes that she could at least help him confirm the reality of his experience. But all Jenny could tell him was that many others have had similar encounters, and as Jenny Randles says, "I have little reason to doubt, at least to doubt that the witness believes it took place." I think that case is important for a number of reasons. First, we have 2 witnesses, so that lends more credence to this case. Also, a period of 24 hours missing. That's quite a long period of time. Again, it's a very early example of missing time. That also makes it important. The sense of peace the witnesses describe, that's also fairly consistent and super interesting. And finally, I think it's important because it shows how profoundly an encounter like this can affect a person for the rest of their lives. He never did, as far as I know, recall what happened during that missing time, and that's true for a lot of people who have this kind of experience. In fact, let's move to the next case. I call this one an unconquerable urge. This occurred in November of 1961 in Pinhal, Brazil. This is a beach area where the gentleman had a little beach house. He had a really incredible encounter that began with a very strong, irresistible impulse to go out onto the beach. This is super interesting to me because there are a number of cases that start exactly this way. This case comes from Coral and Jim Lorenzen of the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization, APRO, and was reported by APRO Chief South American Investigator Olavo T. Fontes, and was published in the book Encounters with UFO Occupants by Jim and Coral Lorenzen. Apparently, Olavo T. Fontes is the primary researcher, but the sole witness in this case is a travel agent and real estate agent, Cavaleiro Mendes. He is also a retired member of the Porto Alegre police force in Brazil. He owned a beach house on Pinhal Beach not far from Porto Alegre in Brazil, and it was around 9:30 p.m. one evening in November of 1961. He was alone in his small beach house. It was a very hot November night. He was unable to sleep, and he found himself being driven by a powerful and inexplicable, unconquerable urge to go out onto the beach and take a walk. He really just wanted to sleep, but unable to resist this urge, he finally just gave in, left his house, and began to walk towards the beach. And almost immediately, he noticed a huge bright light in the sky. He estimated it was about 900 feet away, very low in the sky. He thought for a second it might be a light used by the fishermen who frequent the beach, but he felt this very strong desire to approach it and found himself walking in its direction. Now, getting closer to this light, he was amazed to see that it was actually some kind of object now resting on the beach itself. And he kept walking closer, and he could now see that it was in fact a glowing disc-shaped craft. And the closer he got to it, he says the stronger he felt this urge to approach it. And finally, upon reaching it, he saw two figures step out from behind this craft and move in front of it. He said it was difficult for him to discern any details because the light behind them was so bright, but he could see that they were wearing helmets very similar to those worn by football players. But at this point, Calvalheiro felt he should retreat. It wasn't like he was afraid or panicky, but as he says, he was unnerved by the strangeness of the situation. It was then that he got the impression that the beings were attempting to communicate with him telepathically. And they told him, "Don't resist, because you can't. It's hopeless. If you doubt us, try to move your body." And hearing this, the witness did try to move and found that he was completely unable. He was frozen to the spot like a statue. And these beings approached him, and he says they began to use some kind of instrument on his forehead. But at this point, he lost consciousness or blacked out, and the next thing he knew, he was back very close to his beach house. And this is when he looked at his watch and was surprised to see that it was already 11:30 p.m. His short walk to the beach and brief encounter with the landed UFO and occupants had somehow taken a full 2 hours. Now, at first, the strangeness of his encounter encouraged him to keep it a secret, but after a few weeks, he began to realize that this experience had impacted him very profoundly. Formerly calm and cool, he now became nervous, depressed, anxious. He just wanted to be alone. Several months like this went by when he finally decided it was time to share his experience, and he contacted retired Brazilian Air Force officer Captain F.V. Cardoso and Lieutenant Colonel W.C.B. Schneider of the Brazilian Army. Both of these men were experienced UFO investigators, so he confided his experience to them and they interviewed him in detail. And after hearing everything and knowing that he had missing time, they suggested that he go under hypnosis to remember what happened during this missing time. But Calvalheiro refused. It was just 5 years later, in 1966, that the Betty and Barney Hill case was getting international attention. So researcher Olavo T. Fontes contacted Calvalheiro, informed him of the Hills case, and tried once again to convince him to undergo hypnotic regression and see what happened during this missing time. But once again, the witness steadfastly refused to cooperate. So what occurred during this missing time remains a mystery. Definitely an important and compelling case for a number of reasons. It's very interesting because at this point, missing time was only just beginning to be recognized. The Betty and Barney Hill case was getting some publicity, so that's interesting. It's also, I think, a good case because this witness is of pretty high credibility, a former police officer. He's got no reason to make up stuff like this. And also interesting because he was just dead set against going under hypnosis. So he clearly did have missing time. We see these markers in so many cases where someone is in the middle of an incident and suddenly it's over and they find themselves in a different location. Really important. So let's move to the next case, which I call This May Sound Crazy. This one is another multiple witness case. Half of the cases in this collection are multiple witness cases. Again, raises the level of credence for each of these cases, I think. This one occurred in July of 1968 in Monte Briton, Puerto Rico. This is a very popular tourist spot, actually. It's a beautiful area. But this case is interesting because the description of the humanoid is really almost unique. I mean, there are other similar descriptions of this type of humanoid. No UFO was seen, but this was a crowd of people, well, a fairly large group of people who had this encounter with this humanoid and apparently all experienced missing time. This case comes from prolific researcher Jorge Martin and was published in the publication Evidencia OVNI, issue number 8. The primary witness is Freddie Anderson Radcliffe, but he's certainly not the only witness. It was one afternoon in July 1968 that he and a group of friends had climbed El Yunque, that's a mountain, and they were on their way back from Mount Breton in the El Yunque area of Puerto Rico. They were following the bank of the Rio de la Mina River, which approaches Highway 191. You can see it here. And this is when they suddenly came upon a strange creature that was clearly not human. It stood in the water, no more than 12 feet away from them. And as Freddie, the main witness, says, suddenly we bumped into that thing standing there, about 6 feet tall, and he was pretty skinny. He had long arms, longer than ours, and his hands reached his knees, long hands with long fingers. It had no clothes on. It was all green, and it had a big head that was wider down to the chin. This may sound crazy, but it had something like a fine hair covering its entire body. It had big, high, round eyes, a deep green color, and 2 little cracks for a nose. His mouth was like a thin line without lips. Its hands had only 4 fingers. And another thing, that creature had no ears. Now at this point something very strange happened. The witnesses all seemed to fall into some kind of trance, and the next thing they knew, it was 8 p.m. at night. They were missing about 4 hours of time. And as Freddie says, something strange happened to us there. When we saw that thing out in the water of the river in front of us, it was like 4 in the afternoon. It was daytime. I just can't explain it. We don't know what happened. But when we reacted, it was already night. It was dark. That thing, the creature, was no longer there. We could never explain what happened. We still can't. Confused and frightened, we left there at once. We still don't know what happened there that day, but one thing is certain. That thing, that green creature was there, and we all saw it. It was a very strange thing. Can you imagine having a face-to-face encounter with this strange humanoid during the day, and the next thing you know, it's gone. Suddenly it's night, 4 hours have passed. That's a long time. And it's really interesting because this was not just 1 or 2 people. There was a good number of people who experienced this. Very bizarre. They didn't see any UFO. That's also interesting. I suspect that they may have been taken on board, but it's absolutely pure speculation at this point because we don't know. As far as I know, none of them went under hypnosis, so maybe something else is going on here. This is why taking a closer look at these cases is so important. And there's a lot. Here is another one, which I call I Wanted to Stay with Them. This occurred in the fall of 1973 in Fall Creek Falls, Tennessee. This witness is quite young. However, there's some good evidence in terms of outside supporting witnesses. It's an important case because often contact does start at a very early age. He also had a follow-up visitation, and the missing time aspect was confirmed by his parents. In October of 1973, there was a huge wave of sightings and humanoid encounters sweeping across the United States. It was during this time that a 4-year-old boy, Gavin, that is a pseudonym, had his first experience with a gray ET and missing time. He was with his parents and his older 6-year-old brother, and they were all going horseback riding in the woods at Fall Creek Falls State Park. This is just north of Chattanooga, Tennessee. His father and brother were riding their own separate horses, while Gavin rode with his mother, who was a very experienced rider. Now the first odd thing to occur was that Gavin's older brother's horse became spooked for some reason and nearly ran off with him. Thankfully they did manage to control the horse, but after this neither Gavin or his brother really wanted to continue riding, so their parents allowed them to get off the horses and run ahead on the trail while they followed. This is a pretty rural area, you can see it here. But as Gavin says, after a few moments, my brother and I were alone in the woods. Then everything around us got very quiet, and there was an odd feeling of stillness in the air. My brother got scared and ran back down the trail, leaving me all alone. I then have a memory of a few humanoid-looking, grayish beings coming up next to me. My next memory was being on the edge of the woods with the creatures looking out into a parking lot next to the horse barn. They were saying I had to return to my family. but I recall not wanting to go, but wanting to stay with them. Hesitantly, I walked out of the woods towards the car. I looked over my shoulder one time at them, and then walked up to the car. Now as Gavin approached the family car, his mother rushed up to him, because unknown to him, he had been missing for almost an hour, and they were just about to contact the park ranger to begin a search for him. And as Gavin says, that was my first experience with the Greys. But it was only a few weeks later that he had his second experience, also involving missing time with aliens. His parents had come home after going to a country club for dinner, and they gave him some crackers from the restaurant, which he put on a shelf and went into bed. Now they left the door open, his bedroom door, because Gavin was a little bit afraid to sleep with the door closed. But in the middle of the night he woke up, crawled out of bed, and sat on the floor next to the shelf where he grabbed the crackers. And as he began to open the plastic wrapper, something strange began to happen. As Gavin says, I felt something strange. The first sensation was a feeling like heat on my back. Then I heard a pulsing, humming sound. I looked up and could see a shadow on my door from someone in the hallway. The sensations intensified, and I became afraid. I ran back to my bed and curled up in a ball and closed my eyes. I thought, oh, I should have covered myself with my blanket. So at this point, the pulsing, humming sound became even louder, and Gavin suddenly felt the touch of fingers on his body. But just as suddenly, the feeling stopped, the sound stopped. Gavin opened his eyes and saw that his bedroom was empty and everything was back to normal. But still frightened, he crept out of bed, peered out into the hallway. It was empty, so he cautiously went down the hallway and into his parents' room. He approached his mother's side of the bed, shook her gently, and whispered, "Mom, Mom, wake up!" Strangely, she would not awaken, and this is when he felt that same strange sensation of heat, and again heard the pulsing humming sound. So he became frightened, he fell to the floor, curled up, and as Gavin says, this time I kept my eyes open. I looked over at a dresser with the mirror on top and observed a small figure come out of the wall. It looked grayish in the shadows, and I could see it had a large head and big black eyes. I closed my eyes, but not before I saw some feet move closer to me. Then I felt fingers touching me again. They reached around my head. One of the fingers slipped into my mouth. I then bit down on it as hard as I could. It was soft and not like my own fingers. It had a spongy, rubbery texture to it. Then I blacked out. Now when Gavin woke up, it was already morning. He was still curled up on the floor in his parents' room, and he told them when they woke up, there was a gray tickle monster in my room. And he refused to go back into his room until his father conducted a thorough search. He didn't, of course, find anything, but as Gavin says, the whole experience was terrifying for me. Now, despite his encounter that morning, his parents sent him off to school. Gavin carpooled with 3 other kids, and he explained to them in detail what had happened to him that night. 2 of them did not believe him, but interestingly, the 3rd girl said that she knew what he was talking about, and it turned out she lived just across the street from him. These were apparently Gavin's only encounters, and he actually waited 38 years to report them. A truly profound encounter, and some very interesting details to it. I've heard a number of contactees say that yes, they would have stayed with the ETs given the chance. And while this was clearly somewhat traumatic for the witness, he still wanted to stay with him. How interesting is that? Also interesting is they actually bit the ET. There are a few cases of this. I've investigated some personally. That's also interesting. I would have loved to talk to the brother and see what he remembered, and the parents as well, because as we know, contact is often generational. And if a person is having contact, very likely their parents or grandparents, aunts or uncles, or their children, someone else in their family group is likely having encounters. So there's still a lot of questions about what's going on here that are difficult to answer without having further interviews with the witnesses. But what's amazing is you can disregard that case if you want, because there's always another. Here's a very interesting case. This one doesn't have a whole lot of details to it, but I think it's an important case. I call this one, I Knew It Was a UFO. This occurred on July 15, 1977 in Westchester, Pennsylvania. Pretty active area there. I like this case because it does involve two witnesses and their reaction to this very close-up UFO sighting with humanoids is very interesting and somewhat consistently reported. People do not react the way you think you would when you have a very close encounter like this. Again, this case involves a mother and son. Her son was 18 years old and he is the primary witness. It was on the night of July 15, 1977 that his mother came into his third-floor bedroom in their home in Westchester, Pennsylvania and woke him up. And she said, "I have to show you something." So he followed her down to her bedroom on the second story, and together they looked out the bedroom window at a saucer-shaped object hovering over a building across the parking lot behind their house. And as the son says, "I knew it was a UFO as soon as I saw it." This object was big, about 60 to 75 feet wide, he said. It was dome-shaped on top, had a smaller dome on the bottom, but around the circumference was a row of large, almost 4 foot by 8 foot, colored lights. They were green, orange, red, and yellow, and they were rotating around the circumference. Now above the lights and on the dome itself was a large window, kind of like a windshield, trapezoidal in shape, and as the son says, I could see several occupants through the windshield, 2 tall occupants and 4 shorter ones. So both he and his mom were shocked, and he told his mom that he was going to go to his bedroom to get his telescope so he could take a closer look. But he never made it there. As the son says, "I don't remember what happened after that. The next thing I remembered was walking down the steps without my telescope. My mom was standing in the second-floor hallway and told me the UFO went straight up and was gone in 2 seconds. We then just said goodnight and didn't mention the incident. I turned around and I was walking upstairs to my bedroom. My brain was empty with no thoughts, almost zombie-like." So neither of them talked about this incident to anyone for several years, not to family or friends. Later they would have 2 other sightings, somewhat distant, and in 2014, some 37 years after the first encounter, the son finally did file a report. But what happened during this missing time remains a mystery. Again, not a lot of details to that case, but certainly important. I love that the witness provided a sketch. That always helps to visualize what a person is seeing. It does appear to be a typical UFO, but to me the most interesting aspect is how these witnesses reacted. As if, well, we saw a UFO, let's go to bed. So clearly there's something going on here, psychologically speaking. And I said it before, but missing time is a huge red flag. I do think that they were probably taken on board. I would love to talk to them, ask them if they had any scars on their body, if there was anything else unusual going on, did they have any dreams about this encounter. So there's still some unanswered questions here, but a very good example of what happens when a person has a close-up sighting of UFOs and aliens resulting in missing time. Here's another case, also very interesting. I call this one A Part of Us. This occurred in November of 1980 in Todmorden, UK. It's an important case because there is some physical evidence supporting the reality of this event. It happened to a lady who lived on a farm in a pretty rural area, woke up in the middle of the night and had this amazing encounter. And very clear-cut case of missing time. This case comes from UK-based researcher Nigel Mortimer. He's the author of several books on this subject, and this case first appeared in the February 1990 issue of Northern UFO News in an article written by Nigel. The witness was given the pseudonym Jane. She was 41 years old at the time of the incident and lived on a rural farm just north of Todmorden in the UK. After a hard day's work on her farm, she was awakened suddenly from a deep sleep by a bright orange light shining into her bedroom window. So she woke up, she looked at the clock, she could see it was 1 a.m. She shook her husband, trying to wake him up, but he would not awaken. So looking out her window, she saw what the source of the light was coming from. A brilliant orange oval-shaped object rising up from behind a nearby field. This object was surrounded by an aura of white light. Suddenly, without any warning, Jane found herself walking outside on the landing of her house, without knowing how she got there. And then again, with no apparent transition, she found herself sitting in the grass outside her farmhouse, looking straight at this UFO, and lo and behold, there were 3 strange entities standing beside it. Jane said her body felt numb all over. She tried to stand up, but couldn't. A second attempt to stand up also failed. Jane says she felt as if there was some kind of force holding her down. She saw that the figures were about 5 feet tall and appeared to be wearing, quote, black-colored diving suits. They were standing in the shadow of an outbuilding, and it made it difficult for her to see them in any real detail. But Jane says she later had a very strong, quote, impression that their suits were actually green in color. All 3 of the figures remained very still, and she felt as if they were watching her. But the next thing Jane knew, she was back in bed trying to wake up her husband. He woke up this time, but of course the UFO was now gone, and looking at the clock, she saw that it was now 1:20. This puzzled her because she thought the duration of the encounter was no more than a few moments. So they got up the next morning at 6 a.m. and their son went outside to complete the morning tasks, which are quite a few on a farm. He came into the house for breakfast at 7:30 a.m. and was in shock. He reported that 20 of their chickens, of their flock of 40 chickens, were now dead. All of the chickens in the coop were fine, but all the ones in the chicken run, which was very close to where Jane had seen this UFO hovering, were dead and were emanating a foul odor as if they had been dead for days. Now at this point, Jane hadn't even told her son about the UFO and the humanoids she had seen. Now Jane reported that she had never really shown any interest in UFOs, but she does consider herself an untrained psychic, very proficient in the use of a pendulum, a dowsing rod, doing psychic healing, and this kind of thing. But she does feel that the ETs are somehow connected, she says, with other dimensions. And as she wrote to investigators, and I quote, "I think they were a part of us." One final note is that their son has now become very interested in UFOs and often spends his time skywatching. How interesting is that? There are definitely some patterns here we see in these missing time cases where a person is in one location and suddenly they're in another. She felt herself unable to get up, so there was clearly some absolute influence going on with her. And the chickens at the end of this story is clearly an effect from the UFO, because there was no reason for that many chickens to suddenly just perish. It's also interesting that the witness reports having a lot of psychic abilities. That's a pattern we see in a number of cases. Also interesting to me is that the son became very interested in this subject. So yeah, a lot to learn from that case. And it's funny because you can dismiss one case or two, but there's always another to take its place. And here is another really interesting case. I like this one because this does have 4 witnesses of high credibility. I call this one Some Kind of Aliens. This took place on June 19, 1987 in Croton Falls, New York. This was during the middle of a massive UFO wave in this area, known as the Hudson Valley UFO wave. And this case has some super interesting elements to it in terms of not only having 4 witnesses, but the fact that their car died when this encounter began. So this is what we call electromagnetic disturbances. Happens in a number of these cases. And this is another one which is a very clear-cut case of missing time. This remarkable multiple witness case comes from UFO researcher Philip Imbrogno and appeared in the October-November 1991 issue of UFO Universe. It occurred during the middle of the famous Hudson Valley, New York UFO wave, as I said, which involved not only sightings, but really the full range of UFO ET encounters. It was at 11:30 p.m. on June 19, 1987, that the four witnesses, who were two married couples with professional careers, were on their way back to their homes in Croton Falls after visiting New York City. They were driving south of Brewster and heading towards Croton Falls, and they decided to take a shortcut along a dirt road known as Magnetic Mine Road. You can see it here. It travels along the edge of the Croton Falls Reservoir. This is a dark forested road, so they had the high beams of their car on. They had just passed over a small bridge, you can see it here, and were heading down the road when, for no reason that they could see, their car engine started to fail, and then before long it quit completely. Also, the headlights went out. Now, repeated attempts to restart the engine failed, so the driver finally got out, opened the hood, and inspected the engine, but finding nothing wrong, he returned again to the car, tried again to start it, but of course it still would not start. So all four witnesses sat in the car and were trying to figure out how to handle this situation, and this is when they heard the sound of footsteps off to the side of the car. Now, one of the witnesses rolled down the car window and listened more closely and said, "It sounds like a number of people walking." So one of the men retrieved a flashlight from the glove compartment, and he shone it towards the source of the noise, but didn't see anything, so he exited the car, walked to the edge of the road, and scanned the bushes with his flashlight. And this is when everyone heard him yell fearfully, "Good God!" And he ran back into the car. The others, of course, asked him what he saw, and he said, very fearfully, "Out there, some kind of creatures. They looked like some kind of aliens." Now, at this point, these apparent extraterrestrials walked right up to the car and stood about 10 feet away. All the witnesses could now see them. There were 3 of these figures standing in a row. They described them as 4 feet tall with very large heads. This sounds like grays. The man with the flashlight shone the beam of light on the creatures, which caused the being's eyes to reflect bright orange. Now, as if frightened by this flashlight, the beings reacted by running down the hill into what appeared to be a, quote, hole in the side of the hill. Now, it was at this point that all 4 witnesses saw what they described as a large triangular-shaped object, which had bright yellow lights around the edge. They said it was about the size of a house. It was hovering off to the side of the road about 500 feet up in the air, directly above where the witnesses had seen these short little creatures disappear into the woods. Immediately, the UFO sent down a beam of red light. It moved in 3 wide sweeping circles over the area, and then the object just disappeared. It seemed to wink out and vanishing into thin air rather than moving off. After several minutes of gathering themselves, the driver tried to start the car, and no surprise, it worked. The engine purred to life. They drove home. They made a pact not to tell anyone about the UFO or the humanoids, and they estimated that the encounter lasted about 15 minutes. Now, this encounter occurred about a 20-minute drive from their home, and as the encounter occurred at 11:30 and it took 15 minutes, they should have arrived home about 5 minutes after midnight. But when they got home, they were shocked to see that it was 2:45 a.m., which meant that they were missing considerable time. Says researcher Philip Imbrogno, this incident is still under investigation. Those witnesses are absolutely prime candidates to go under hypnosis to see if what happened during this missing time. Because when you have 4 witnesses, they could corroborate each other's stories, and it would be very interesting to know what was uncovered through the use of hypnotic regression. I do support the use of hypnosis, but only as a last resort. I'd always first advise people, if you have missing time, to write down everything you remember. Go back to that and fill in all the details you can. Try doing meditation. Try working with your dreams to recall, because both of those are very effective methods to recall missing time. But hypnosis works. Done correctly, it's been absolutely proven to be accurate, but only if done correctly, because done incorrectly, it's been proven to show false memories as well. This is why it's so controversial. And these missing time cases are so numerous. Here's another. I call this one, "It Sends Chills Down My Spine." This one to me is really interesting. It is a single witness case. This occurred on October 22nd, 1988 in a rural area, Joe Daviess County, Illinois. But this one is so interesting because this witness, he describes in vivid detail seeing ETs, a landed UFO, and having a very clear-cut case of missing time. The witness in this case is a 14 or 15-year-old boy by the name of Oscar. That's a pseudonym. He and his father had driven his 1973 Chevy pickup from their home in Shullsburg, Wisconsin, and traveled a few miles south across the Illinois border to go deer hunting in the wilds of Joe Daviess County, Illinois. So the teenager Oscar climbed up into a tree stand and waited while his father hunted in another tree stand about a mile away. It was well after dark at this point when a deer wandered close enough for Oscar to get a shot at it, and he hit the deer, but it quickly bounded off into the trees. His father came back shortly later. Oscar told him about the deer, so together they followed the blood trail to locate this deer. Now his father was paying very close attention to the ground and tracking the deer, and this is when Oscar observed a violet light hovering over the tree line and traveling from left to right. He tried to tell his father, who told him, "Quit messing around." Now Oscar shone his flashlight at this glowing light, and it darted off very fast into the trees. So they tried tracking this deer for a while longer, but lost sight of the trail. His father told Oscar it was probably a brisket shot, meaning low in the chest, and that they would resume tracking in the morning. So they hiked back to the truck and went to sleep in the back. It was at some point late in the night or very early in the morning that things began to get very strange. And I'll just quote Oscar directly, as he says, "I remember having a frightening feeling that someone was watching me, to the point I didn't want to open my eyes. I did. And through the side window, I saw what I think was the big-eyed, big-headed gray looking at me. I closed my eyes, and I heard what was like a mechanical voice telling me, 'We are not going to hurt you.' Then something made me open the back window of the truck cab and get out. And when I did, I observed 3 short aliens and 2 taller big-headed and big-eyed aliens, and a disc-shaped craft landed in the field about 200 feet away. I remember the little ones touching my fingers and leading me towards the craft and saying, 'Do not be scared,' in a mechanical voice that seemed to be in my head. That is all I remember. I woke up in the back of the truck thinking, boy, was that a vivid, scary dream." But the more he thought about it and started seeing images of grays on TV, Oscar came to realize that it probably wasn't a dream at all, but more likely, as he says, quote, "an abduction." It took him 27 years to file a report, and it affected him for the rest of his life. As he says, "It has bothered me since it happened. To this day, when I see an image on TV of a big-headed, big-eyed gray alien, it sends chills down my spine." That is such an amazing case, and really quite typical. He clearly encountered grays, and I think it's a pretty good bet that he was taken on board, given that he recalls being actually led to this craft. Would love to talk to him. I suspect that there probably were some dreams about what happened on that night. I suspect there's probably some other events, because rarely is this a one-off. But a very typical case of missing time. And there's so many of these kinds of cases. Here's another one. This one is probably the most profound for me in this collection. This one really touched me in a way that just made me feel for the witnesses in this case, a father and son. What a very close encounter. I call this one, "It's Time to Tell the Truth." This occurred on July 25, 1989. possibly early August. They're a little confused about the date. It occurred in Catoosa, Oklahoma, while they were driving at night. That's an interesting detail because so many of these missing time cases occur at night. But this is a really important case. There's some physiological evidence. There are two witnesses. They describe this in absolute vivid detail. They're very emotional about it, very clear in their descriptions. And it's just an amazingly profound case. The two witnesses in this case are a father and his 12-year-old son named Michael, again from Catoosa, Oklahoma. And it was on or around July 25, 1989, that they had gone to visit some extended family members, their cousins. It was around 7:30 p.m. They were returning home, driving south on Keatonville Road. You can see it here. The father who was driving pulled off to the side to stop and light a cigarette. And this is when they noticed a small, odd-looking cloud hanging low in the sky ahead of him. It was weird because it was the only cloud in the sky. And they immediately noticed some, quote, strange-looking lights. Again, low in the sky, not far away, they immediately saw two orbs, one blue and one red, skipping in and out of this cloud, appearing and disappearing from view. But then, events quickly escalated to very high strangeness. As the father says, "We watched in shock and disbelief as a disc-shaped craft emerged from the small cloud and silently and swiftly descended to less than 50 yards from our car. It continued to slowly move to about 30 yards from us. They were close enough for me to see them, the aliens, looking at us through windows. They seemed to be somewhat small from that distance. We could see a ring of windows around the craft. They were close enough to see and count the beings inside. 4 of them were small, childlike in size. One was taller, and one was the tallest. Sudden fear overcame me, and I remember attempting to drive off as fast as I could. We were scared, and started to leave real fast, when a strange bluish light hit us." Now his son Michael saw all of this as well, and as he says, "I was very frightened, but I could not look away. We never lost sight of the craft. After a few minutes, the craft approached our car. It was massive, roughly the size of a large house, maybe bigger. It was a silver egg-shaped craft with windows. We could see entities inside of it staring back at us. 2 different kinds of entities were on board. Some were very tall, some were very short. Then a beam of light came out of the craft and focused on our vehicle and filled the inside of the car with light. When the light hit us, we were paralyzed and unable to move. And then there were 4 to 5 beings standing around our car, 2 on each side of the car at the doors." So he seems to remember a little bit more than his father does. But as his father says, "The next thing we remember is we are still in the car. The cigarette has burned up, the car is not running now, and we are sitting slumped over in the seats. I looked up and watched the craft leave the area. It seemed to float, unaffected by Earth's gravity. When it left, it moved off slowly at first, then accelerated so fast that it seemed to vanish. I started the car when we drove home as fast as we could. We both felt like we had been asleep, or drugged, or hypnotized." And his son Michael verifies this. As Michael says, "Next thing I know, we are back in the car. The ship is still in front of us. A white misty fog is being produced by the ship, and it then disappeared into thin air. It simply vanished before my eyes. Please take this seriously." So it was now dark outside, and upon arriving home, they estimated that they were missing 30 to 45 minutes of time. They called their cousins, who they had just visited, and they confirmed the time. It was 3 days after this encounter that the father found a triangular-shaped, semi-transparent object in his finger. He dug it out and removed it, and said it looked kind of like silicon, but it was harder than a rock and smaller than a BB. That really concerned them. This whole encounter was a huge wake-up call for them both. As the father says, "This is very real. It is the factual truth. It happened to us, and we are still very concerned about what they did to us, and why they did it. We can only speculate what the implants are for and what effect it will have in the future. I went from skeptical to an absolute believer in the first 5 to 10 seconds of the close-up visual of the craft with the little beings peering at us. You would too. It was a disk with a ring of windows around the center and aliens looking at us as we looked back at them. We didn't talk about it outside of each other for fear that people would not be able to believe the truth. I'm still very concerned about my son. I wish I knew what their agenda was. We were in the wrong place at the wrong time. That was something you never forget. I am getting older now, and I think it's time to tell the truth. God be with us all. So the father first reported his case in 2008, but 4 years later both he and his son Michael filed a second report with more details. Michael filed a third report in 2015, and he described the egg again as egg-shaped or saucer-shaped, emitting orbs in a beam of light, and like his dad, it was obvious to him that this was not a conventional craft. Both now believe that they were probably taken on board and implanted, because Michael also found an implant on his arm near the elbow. And as Michael says, this is not a hoax or an attempt to get 15 minutes of fame. These were very real occurrences. I am plagued every day about what happened to me and my father. I don't know that anyone can fully understand what it's like to have a missing time encounter unless they've actually gone through it themselves. It's very disorienting. It can be very confusing and frightening and raises all kinds of questions. And as you can see, it affects a person profoundly. So my heart goes out to these witnesses. This is one of the reasons I do this research, because so many people have this kind of experience. Yeah, I've had one myself, a missing time encounter. So I absolutely know what it's like. Let's move to the next case, which I call A Presence in My Room. This occurred on August 17, 1994 in Alabama. This is an amazing case because you might not think of it, but the most common place that people see an ET, a humanoid, is not outside, not driving late at night, not in some rural area, but in their own bedroom, in their own home. And this is a very difficult aspect of this because we look at, I think, our home, and particularly our bedroom, as our sacred space, a place that we won't be bothered. And yet this is where ETs often come to initiate contact. That's absolutely what happened in this case. The main witness in this case is Elaine. That's a pseudonym. And as she says, I have been very apprehensive to tell my story, as I'm sure most are. I have only told 2 people about this. I would like to know what happened to me that night, I think. It was around 11 p.m. on August 17, 1994. Elaine had gone to bed, her husband was at work, and her 2 children, aged 10 and 12, were asleep in the other room. And I'll just let Elaine describe in her own words what happened. She says, I woke up abruptly to a brilliant light coming through my bedroom window over my bed. I looked at my alarm clock. It was 2:20 a.m. I immediately became aware of a presence in my room. I was disoriented and I thought it was a break-in. I remember being horrified for my children and attempting to reach for my pistol that I kept in my bedside table. I suddenly became paralyzed and unable to move anything but my eyes. I was slowly turned from my side onto my back by an unseen force. When I was turned over, I saw 4 beings, 2 at the end of my bed at each corner, and 2 on each side of me close to my head. I wasn't able to see the ones standing at my head as well. They were in my periphery, but I had a clear view of the 2 at the end of the bed. They were grays, wearing black hooded robes. They were short, maybe 4 feet. I could see their faces and their hands. They were the typical grays reported by so many people. They did not speak or attempt to communicate with me. I slowly began to levitate off the bed, still paralyzed. They never touched me. But as soon as I was levitated about a foot off the bed, I was slowly floated out of the bedroom and down the hall, with 2 on each side. They were small enough that they were able to stay at my side as I floated prone down the hall. While Elaine was afraid, her main concern was for her children asleep in the other room. She now noticed a fifth gray, which was walking along with her near her head. And as Elaine says, "As we turned the corner at the end of the hallway, I saw that my front door was opened, and the same brilliant light was shining through the door. It was so bright it was blinding. At that moment I was partially able to break my paralysis and attempted to grab the corner of the wall as we went past it. That is the very last thing I remember." Elaine's next memory is waking up in bed. She sat up and stared at her alarm clock. It was now 5 a.m. She was missing approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes of time. She remembered the previous night's events with perfect clarity up to the moment she was rendered unconscious, which she suspects was done by the ETs to subdue her. She has no memory of being on board a craft or anything else that may have happened to her on that night. And like many witnesses, it took her a long time to report it. 28 years, in fact, mainly because she had no idea who to contact. But she is very curious to know if regressive hypnosis might bring back more memories of what happened to her on that fateful evening. That is a somewhat harrowing case. I mean, can you imagine waking up to see ETs in your room and then you're being floated out of bed and out the front door, and there's this very bright light and you break free of the paralysis and grab onto the wall? I mean, it's crazy. Yet there are so many cases like this. This is the kind of thing that make people really question what's going on with them. I'm sure that this witness probably has had other encounters because, as I said earlier, it's rarely a one-off. Contact often starts at very early childhood. So I have a whole checklist of questions I ask people when they report this kind of experience, because I do think, again, that they are being taken on board, and this is something that usually happens throughout a person's life. So many questions. So let's move to the next case. This is another important case because it is a multiple witness case, and this missing time aspect in this case is particularly interesting. I call this one, "It Got Frightening." This occurred on October 5, 1995 at a campground, a very rural campground called Red Canyon, New Mexico. This case has some very, very unusual elements to it. Red Canyon Campgrounds is a beautiful and remote campground in the Manzano Mountains south of Albuquerque, New Mexico. It is heavily forested, rich with wildlife. You can see it here. And on October 5, 1995, a couple, Mark and Natalie, those are pseudonyms, and their 4-year-old son were enjoying the solitude and nature, sitting by the campfire and watching an elk as it wandered through their campsite. But as it got late, they climbed into the bed in their camper shell and went to bed. Their son slept between them. It was about 1 a.m. that Natalie woke up to see a bright light shining through the trees some distance away. She looked out the window and saw, quote, 3 silhouettes. And when these 3 figures moved closer, she became concerned and woke up her husband. He took a brief glimpse out the window, but just kind of dismissed this as nothing unusual. But Natalie disagreed and pointed out the bright lights and insisted he take a closer look. So he did, and as Natalie says, "As we stared, they kept getting closer, and this is where it got frightening. At one point we could see them outlined very clearly. I shined a flashlight out at them to get a better look. They stopped advancing towards us. There were 3 of them. Their heads were not shaped like human heads. The arms were very long. The hands hung down by their knees and had 3 fingers each. Their faces were indistinguishable. The striking features were the head shape, the long thin arms, and 3 fingers. The beings," she said, "seemed to be holding a light of some kind, like a flashlight, and this light now began to swing back and forth, and at the same time the figures continued their approach. The light became more brilliant and started to blink orange and white over and over, and as Natalie says, then they were very close. The light was super bright. I remember being so frightened, and suddenly I got very sleepy. I remember thinking, I'm so terrified but at least I'm falling asleep and won't have to feel it anymore. It was blissful, like when you are about to go into surgery and the anesthesia hits suddenly. The next thing I remember was waking up in our truck camper at 11 a.m. Now at this point, neither Natalie nor her husband Mark had any memory whatsoever of the previous night's events. It was wiped completely from their minds. But still, the weird events weren't quite over yet. They got up and were cleaning up their campsite, packing up and preparing to leave, when two strange men rode up on horseback. This was weird. As Natalie says, I noticed right away they looked out of place. Having grown up in the rodeo, helping my dad break wild horses and riding them for years, I knew the gear, the clothing, the mannerisms of riders. These two guys were wearing what looked like brand new felt vests. The horses' gear looked new, and the men sat very straight up in the saddles. They looked like actors portraying guys on horseback. I smiled and in a typical friendly Texas way said, "Hi." They looked at me sternly, and one of them said, "Not many people come up here in this remote area. How was your evening?" My husband answered it was fine. The sky's beautiful at night. We're just packing to get out of here. They never smiled, acted very official, and just said, "Good." I thought the exchange was very weird. So later that day, they drove into the town of Mountain Air, just a few miles to the southeast. Weirdly, their truck promptly died, and they ended up staying in a motel in town for 3 days until their truck was fixed. And it wasn't until 10 years later that Natalie was sitting at her computer in her home in Texas when the memory of the strange incident at Red Canyon campgrounds suddenly came back to her spontaneously. And as Natalie says, we literally had no recollection all those years of what we had seen. I thought that's weird. We never talked about seeing them or even remembered seeing them. My husband preferred to forget the whole incident, but once it came back into my memory, I could not. Natalie did try to share the story with others, but everyone seemed skeptical or disinterested. She said a few years after the incident, her son did complain of someone outside looking into his bedroom window. And a few times when he woke up, he would find that his body had been turned around. His feet were on his pillow, and his head was at the foot of his bed. Also following the incident, her husband had a few strange nightmares and would thrash around in his sleep screaming in terror, "Help! Somebody help me!" It was only after reading about aliens and greys that Natalie was shocked to see that the drawings matched very closely the figures that they had seen on that night. And as Natalie says, I just wonder, in the back of my mind, if we didn't encounter real alien beings out there. Another very clear-cut case of missing time. And what's amazing to me about this particular case is not only did they have missing time, they completely forgot the entire encounter for years. This does happen. Some people will just not recall anything whatsoever until there's some sort of trigger. Suddenly they just remember. That's clearly what happened in this case. Another very interesting aspect is these two cowboys that rode up following the encounter started acting peculiar. They looked peculiar. They were giving them peculiar questions. So that makes me wonder about that. Could that have been maybe not a screen memory, but I don't know, ETs in disguise? That sort of thing does turn up in a number of these cases. It's a very high strangeness detail that really raises more questions than it answers. I don't know. It's why research is so important. Let's move on to the next case. This is the last one in this collection. I call this one, I Floated Up Out of Bed. This is very much like an earlier case in this compilation where a gentleman woke up to find ETs, apparent ETs, in his bedroom. These are not your typical greys. This is a type of being that I've heard reported many times. I have a few cases myself, and the way he describes them and the image he provides is absolutely matching up with the other cases I've investigated and know about. This one occurred on October 1st, 2017 in Vienna, Virginia. And it's another fascinating case. The witness in this case is Chuck. That's not his real name, but he's pretty sure that on the evening of October 1st, 2017, he was taken on board a craft by aliens. But his encounter is shrouded in the phenomenon we call missing time. On that evening, he was asleep in bed with his wife in their home in Vienna, Virginia. Now, Chuck suffers from sleep apnea. He has to sleep partially sitting up. He has to wear a CPAP machine, complete with face mask and air hose. And it was sometime in the middle of the night that he woke up. Due to his inclined position, he was able to see the bedroom door very clearly and saw that a bright light under the door was coming into his room, obviously originating from the hallway. But as Chuck says, the door opened and in walked several squat figures. I am not sure of the exact number. They were silhouetted by a bright light in the hall. They were dark blue-gray with large blocky heads and virtually no neck. Their faces were heavily furrowed. They stood 3 to 4 feet tall and wore something that looked like a monk robe that was very dark gray. When they entered the room, I became paralyzed. They stood around the bed, even on the other side where my wife was asleep. I tried to call out to her, but I could not make a sound due to the paralysis. Now, unable to move, Chuck could only lay there as one of the figures moved closer and removed the CPAP mask from his face, while another pulled the covers off his bed. As Chuck says, they raised their arms and I floated up out of the bed, lying flat now. I floated above their heads towards the door. As I began to float out the doorway, I lost consciousness. Now, presumably, Chuck was taken somewhere, perhaps on board, though he does have no actual memory of this. He didn't see a UFO. But as Chuck says, the next thing I remember is floating above their heads back into the room towards the bed. I was angry, very angry, and with great effort I began to thrash about a little. For some reason, they had difficulty controlling me through my anger. One of the figures on the far side of the bed, next to my wife, knocked something over on the dresser, but immediately righted it and put it back where it belonged. They regained control of me. They successfully floated me back into my bed and pulled the covers back over me. They then retreated from the room. After they closed the door, the light went out and all was quiet. I regained my senses and found myself lying in my bed without my CPAP mask on. I looked at the clock and it was 5:53 a.m. I got up out of bed feeling both frightened and angry at the same time. Now, after his wife woke up, he asked her if she had experienced anything unusual in the night, and she said yes, that she had actually gotten up 3 times to go to the bathroom. Usually she only gets up once, so that was slightly abnormal. Chuck immediately began doing research, looking for any other images of the humanoids that he had seen. And it took him quite a long time, but he did finally find a case in upstate New York that matched what he saw. 1 week after his encounter, he did report it to MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, writing that he believed he had experienced, quote, an alien abduction. So these beings sound very much like the beings Whitley Strieber describes, these little blue-skinned, troll-like beings. My own sister-in-law had an encounter with these beings. She drew an illustration of them. One gentleman I interviewed saw that illustration and nearly got knocked out of his chair. That was exactly what he saw. And the drawing that the witness provides in this case looks very, very much like my sister-in-law's drawing. And she's an artist, so she was able to get the details correctly. And I've shown this to other contactees, and they're like, yep, that's what they looked like. So that's interesting. Also interesting is how this gentleman was wearing a CPAP machine and the ETs removed it. Like the other case, he's floated up out of bed, carried through the hallway, and he remembers actually being returned as well. So yeah, it's a pretty sure bet that he was taken on board, probably physically examined, talked to the ETs. Very hard to say what happened to him because he doesn't recall. But we can say from other cases, we can predict to a large degree what happens to a person when they're taken on board. but an absolutely fascinating case. So that's it. 12 cases coming from all over the world. This has been going on for a very long time. Missing time is again, big part of the UFO experience. And we need to figure out exactly what's going on here. Why is this happening? Who is responsible? This is why I'm putting these cases out there so we can all take a closer look and try to answer these questions for ourselves. So that's it for today. I hope you found this episode interesting, and I thank you very much for watching it. It's because of you guys I'm doing this research, so I truly appreciate all the support you give me. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for the truth. Most important of all, keep having fun. And I'll see you next Friday for another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Bye for now.